These are the woods just outside of Sheffield. And this is pretty close to where I grew up. Today is bitterly cold. But I don't really mind, because today I get to be in one of the most beautiful places on the planet, doing something that I love. Hi everyone, Joe Garth here, creator of Brushify.io. In this video, I'm going to be 3D scanning the tree that you see behind me, and I'm going to be importing that into Unreal Engine. I'm going to be showing you a bit of my photogrammetry pipeline, and sort of taking you along the journey of reconstructing a tree in full 3D. One of the most important things in 3D scanning is actually picking the right object. So here you can see that I've picked a tree that's completely isolated from any other objects. If I look at some of the other trees in the surrounding area, you can see that they have walls next to them, or they're even on the edge of cliffs. So ideally, you're going to want to pick a tree that's very isolated, where you've got access from 360 degrees from all sides, and you're going to easily be able to get to the tree trunk itself. The same principle applies to anything you're going to scan, whether those are rocks or, things on the street. Basically, you're just going to want to make sure that you can get all the way around the object. Here in the UK, one of the main issues with 3D scanning is always the unpredictable weather. Ideally, it's best to scan in overcast weather conditions. It's February right now, and there are plenty of overcast days, so I thought I'd take this opportunity to get as many snowy scans as possible. When I'm scanning, I like to move in sort of a circular pattern around the object. I don't use a tripod, and I prefer to work with a smaller, lighter camera with image stabilization, because this really speeds up the process. Once I get back to my computer, I take the photos off my camera and I import them into a program called Agisoft Metashape. The program uses the photos from all the various angles to build up a 3D point cloud of the tree trunk. From there, I'm able to clean up the point cloud a little bit, and then I'm able to generate a 3D mesh from the resulting points. Generating the 3D mesh is quite a time-consuming process and uses a lot of processing power, so you'll need a fast computer in order to do this quickly. Once I've got this initial 3D mesh, I can then export that to Blender and do some cleanup on it. This usually involves things like cleaning up any open edges and making those a little bit smoother, and deleting any sort of floating parts of the mesh, basically things that will look untidy in the game engine. I usually tend to try and simplify the UV maps and the UV mapping process by removing any twigs or branches that are sticking out of the tree in the photogrammetry itself. I also like to take the roots and the sort of bottom of the tree and that open edge and then just smooth out all the vertices there to make things look a little bit cleaner. Now the mesh is all cleaned up, I'm able to start laying down the UV seams and then packing the UV maps. The next step is to re-import the cleaned up and UV'd mesh back into Metashape so that we can reproject all of the textures onto that version. There's a quite hidden but really awesome functionality in Metashape that lets us do that, and you can access that by going to Build Textures and making sure you choose Keep UV. This saves a ton of time and is a real game changer because you can do the texture baking within the same application. And now we've got the textures projected, so we've got the best of both worlds. We've got all of those details as well as a good UV layout. After that, I can export the OBJ and the texture and then import it into Unreal Engine and take a look at it with some basic materials. So that's the tree trunk scanned. Let's go to the next step in the capture process. Okay, so now that I've done the tree trunk itself, it's time to start capturing the little branchlets and branches of the tree. And to do that, I'm going to actually have to switch lenses. At the moment, I have a 16mm Sigma lens on there, which is great for capturing wide amounts, wide stuff like the tree trunk. But if I want to get really zoomed in and still get really nice sharp photos, I'm going to need a much narrower lens. So to do that, I'm going to switch to my 45mm, and because we're on the Micro Four Thirds system, there's a 2x crop factor, which means it's equivalent to a 90mm. The idea here is to focus on the top of the tree and try to isolate individual branches against the sky. I also make sure that I capture all these stills in RAW format so that I'm able to take them into Photoshop later and tweak things like the exposure and try and get more detail and more range out of the image. In order to create a clean alpha mask, a white background is really essential. This is yet another reason why scanning on an overcast day is really optimal. The less noise in the sky, the better. From a white background, generating the mask is really simple. I can just use the color range selector, and then I can adjust the fuzziness until it's just right. After this, the mask still won't be 100% perfect though. You'll notice these little blue outlines around the edges. To fix this, I control and click on my mask, and then I go up to select, modify, and then I contract by about 5 pixels. From there, it's just a case of inverting the selection, and then using the content aware fill to actually fill the area with some colored pixels that aren't the blue pixels that were on that sort of ugly outline before. And this is a really cool trick because it means that when we export the alpha into the engine, the alpha mask in combination with this color map isn't going to result in any sort of black outline. Once I'm happy with the mask, I export the alpha into the engine and I check that out with my foliage shader and make sure that everything looks good. From there, I can go in and remove any of the parts of the branches that I don't need and sort of clean up the mask a little bit so that I can isolate just the branch that I want. Before I continue with the branchlets, there's a very important part of this whole process that I haven't talked about yet, and that is the generation of the actual branch structure of the tree itself. To create the branch structure of the tree, I use a plugin for Blender called Modular Tree. This plugin is actually extremely easy to use, it's completely free, and it's node-based, and really what I do here is I just tweak the various values until I can closely match my photo reference for the tree that I want to create. Obviously this is really time consuming and I'm constantly flipping back and forth between pictures of my reference tree and Blender and just trying to get something that looks as realistic as possible. After generating the branch structure, I also need a tiling bark texture to put onto that in order to actually texture it and have something to work with when blending it in with the photogrammetry. So to create the bark texture, I go through my photos of the tree trunk and I use those to actually generate the texture in Photoshop. The process is really simple. Just take a tree trunk image like this one, crop it down, and then just sort of adjust the rotation a little bit so that it's in a sort of straight line, and that should give you some sort of an image like this. And then the next step is to kind of lay these images sort of side by side against each other on a square shaped Photoshop document. From there, the trick is to use the content aware fill to actually blend the various images together and create a single seamless texture. I then put the texture through Topaz Gigapixel AI in order to maximize the sharpness and the amount of detail that's in the image that can sometimes get lost from image manipulation. So now we've got our tiling bark texture. I can actually apply that to the generated tree in Blender and we can see how that looks. The UVs will definitely need some scaling and adjusting to minimize the amount of tiling that's visible, but I think the results are actually pretty good right out of the box. So now the really tricky part comes. We actually need to integrate and sort of merge these two different meshes together. On the bottom, we have the photogrammetry mesh, and then on the top, we have the generated tree mesh. And here you can see that I'm basically slotting the two meshes into each other and really carefully scaling them and aligning them so that they look like they're the same tree. In addition to the correct placement, the other thing that we need to do is actually manipulate the mesh itself so that we can sort of hide the blend between the two different meshes. To do that, I use something called proportional editing in Blender, which is similar to, if you've used 3D Studio Max or Maya, it's similar to soft selection. This lets you manipulate a group of vertices while also sort of softly moving the ones around it. I'm constantly re-importing this merged mesh into the engine. and then double checking how that seam looks between the two different meshes. When I see anything that stands out as a problem or something that's going to give away the transition between the two meshes, then I immediately go back to Blender and start moving vertices around again, changing up UVs, doing anything possible to basically remove visual defects and hide the seams. When trying to hide the seam between the two meshes, it's really important that we don't have any straight lines. That means that later on, when we match the actual texture, color, and some of the details themselves, we'll be able to blend the two together really effectively. This is probably one of the most time-consuming parts. It really is just about having a bit of attention to detail and constantly going back and forth and tweaking little things to make sure that things blend really seamlessly. After about 20 to 30 minutes of tweaking, I now have a merged tree trunk and branch structure all in one mesh that doesn't seem to have any super obvious seams. This is also a great point to jump into the game as the player and just check if we can find anything glaringly obvious, see if we can notice any seams, anything like that. So yeah, there are a few little issues here and there that I still need to fix at this point. You can see a hole in the mesh right there. But in general, we're on the right track. Now that we have a nice merged tree, we're going to have to fill that with leaves. So to do that, I create a texture atlas. This is basically a bunch of various different masks from the leaves that we were cutting out earlier, all placed into the same single 4K texture. When I've finished with that texture, I bring that into Blender, and then I map it onto a plane and make sure that the alpha transparency is on there. After that, I start to cut out the various different branches or branchlets, and basically create what's going to be the geometry for all of our leaves. Because these leaves are going to be duplicated multiple times, it's best to keep the shapes really simple and use as few polygons to cut them out as possible. In case you're wondering, the reason why we cut out the leaves very close to the alpha mask is actually to reduce overdraw in the engine. The larger that the leaf polygons are, the more shader overdraw is going to happen in the engine, and obviously that's a very bad thing for performance when you have lots of leaves overlapping. Now we have these cutouts, I'm able to start placing the pivots correctly so that I can start distributing these on the tree itself. This is obviously a really time-consuming process, but there are some little tricks that I use to speed things up a little bit. One thing that I use a lot is Blender's snapping function, which basically allows me to snap the pivot directly onto the branch mesh. And this means that I just really need to snap it right to the mesh, and then I just sort out the rotation and sort of place things that way. The other thing I like to do is sort of pre-build, sort of prefabricated little branchlets like this one, and then I can just take that and place it at different points in the tree. It should also be noted that as I'm going through this really tedious placement process, I'm also constantly re-importing this mesh into the engine and checking it from different angles, comparing it to reference, and just generally making sure that things are looking good. For the lower branches especially, it really helps to really pay attention to the details and to make sure that things are going to look good from the player's eye level. Luckily, for the majority of the tree, we can actually generate leaves using the modular tree add-on. I simply pick the geometry that it should use as a leaf, and then it procedurally scatters that geometry over the entire tree. This is also really cool because as I adjust the source geometry, it's basically updating all of the instances. So here you can see that I'm actually scaling the geometry, and all the leaves on the tree are now being scaled. The procedural approach is a lot quicker, but also sacrifices attention to detail in terms of the placement of the individual leaves. So I only really recommend it for the overall tree and not really for the leaves and branches that are going to be close to the player on the sort of player eye level. I'm now at the point where I can have a bit of fun, just duplicating the same tree and having a look at it from all the different rotations, seeing how it kind of works as a sort of forest, and whether or not, there are any kind of obvious issues with the mesh that I need to fix, or with the textures, for instance. There is still an absolute ton of little details to get right. The textures need tweaking, the shaders need tweaking. Here I'm going in and correcting the roughness on the leaves, on the tree trunk. I'm trying to make things consistent and put in the right parameters. I'm at the point now where I can fiddle around with the cinematic camera and just check how everything is rendering there. And just see what it's like to play around with all the different materials and have a look at how the tree looks from different angles. Just check that there's nothing really obvious that's going to be wrong with the geometry, and see if I can really just make it look good at this stage. I'm also constantly taking screenshots and really analyzing the texturing, the mesh, pixel by pixel, seeing how it looks at different resolutions, seeing how it looks overall, and just making sure that there isn't anything really obvious. I think a lot of it boils down to just spending a lot of time in the asset zoo, looking at things from all angles and just ironing out any kinks in the armor. And also trying to create these sort of beautiful screenshots is also a really cool way to find issues with your assets, because you can take a beautiful screenshot and then realize, oh, these are the things that are actually wrong with this asset and that are preventing this screenshot from looking, sort of photoreal. And that could be, maybe the seams that are visible, or maybe it could be little glitches, or it could be something wrong with the shading. It's a really good exercise to try and take really nice screenshots of your assets and see what the problems are when you get really close to them, and try and take very detailed photos. Before I move any further, I think a quick overview of the whole journey so far will help to simplify things. There are really three main elements that I have to assemble in order to build a tree. The first was the tree trunk, which I did using Photogrammetry. That's the process where we take dozens of photos of an object and use those photos to generate a 3D model. The next element are the branches. This is done via procedural generation in Blender, in my case using a plugin called Modular Tree. The tiling texture that's used on this is then assembled using photos taken of the real tree trunk. Last are the branchlets, which are created by taking high-resolution photos of the branches at the top of the tree, isolated against the sky. These are then chopped into geometry, which is then scattered around the mesh, both manually and procedurally. So in this slide, you can see all three elements. Each of these require both geometry and texture, and they each have a different technique that's required to generate them. In the case of a tree, it's really important to consider the limitations of real-time graphics, and that's one of the reasons this is done in quite a restrictive way. Only 3 4K textures are used, and geometry is kept as simple as possible. For the final step, I try to create a little scene for my newly created tree and try and get it to match the reference. I'm simply using the Brushify auto material, and if you want to check out how that works, look at some of the other videos on my channel, or you can take a look at my Learn Squared course for a full tutorial series on how to use all of the Brushify shaders and the Unreal Engine landscaping tools. Initially, I just try and set up a very basic landscape, just some rolling hills, smooth shapes, and the auto material does a pretty good job of texturing that. Once the landscape is in place, I can then start to paint down some foliage, and here I'm just using some heather from the Brushify Moorlands pack. I was constantly checking against the reference and trying to adjust my tree so that it sort of matches it a little bit, and obviously going back and forth with the reference really helps to give you an idea of how you can get closer with the scene. I then went on to start placing some rocks, and these were actually some new scans that I got fairly recently. I decided to tweak the shader a little bit. With the Brushify shader, I can easily add snow to the tops of things like rocks and other geometry. So I use that to quickly add snow to the assets and make them sort of more integrated into this snowy scene. I wanted to make sure there was a bit more of an extended backdrop, sort of a vista, so I added a second landscape, which I then again threw the Brushify auto material onto and just quickly sculpted a little bit, a few basic hill shapes. Just to break up the horizon line so there was no sort of flat line along the horizon. I then adjusted the fog a little bit and started adding some trees right off into the distance. I felt like my tree was looking a little bit lonely, so I added a few more of the same tree just to the midground, and I think this adds a little bit more complexity to the scene and helps it look a bit more interesting. I'm constantly adjusting the lighting, and I'm never really settled on a sort of sun direction until really almost the very end. The great thing about working in real time is you can just continually change things, so I can always change the light direction, I can always tweak where the assets are and how they're placed. I really hope you guys enjoyed this quick little overview and sort of behind the scenes of my asset creation process. I also really hope that it inspires you to go out and start scanning and creating your own assets. With tools like Unreal Engine and Blender, I really don't think there's been an easier time to learn real-time graphics and 3D modeling. The techniques that I've used in this video are quite similar to those that are widely used in the games industry. One of the best ways, I think, to learn is to open up games like the original Crysis, or even more modern titles like Red Dead Redemption 2, The Last of Us, or Battlefront 2, and take a look at how the photorealistic foliage is constructed in those games. If you enjoyed watching this type of behind-the-scenes content, and you'd like to see more of it in the future, I'd greatly appreciate if you'd subscribe to my channel and like the video. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. So after a hard day's work, you have to find some rewards for yourself. So pork scratchings, Kit Kat. It's been in my pocket for about 3 months. And I think with that, I will sign off and sign out. Oh, good.